Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be painting an urban cityscape using for my inspiration a photograph that I found on Pixabay. I'll leave a link to it in the description below along with all the other details. Now I painted this one as a 4-part tutorial for my Patreon group where I explain all the details about painting it and show just about every brush stroke. If you'd like to see that, then please follow the link to Patreon below, but bear in mind it's probably best not to join Patreon if you're thinking of it until after the 1st of February, because if you join today you'll be charged that day, then you'll be charged again on the 1st of the month, so best to wait till after the 1st of the month. I've simplified the scene and roughly sketched it out onto my Saunders Waterford cold pressed paper, which is taped to my board, and my board's at an angle of about 45 to 60 degrees. This is yellow ochre, and I just want to create a nice strong graduated sky wash, so I'm using my large bamboo haki brush and I'm just sweeping it across the wet page backwards and forwards, sort of horizontal sweep, so I can get a nice smooth wash. It doesn't have to be perfect, but I want it to be fairly smooth. Now I'm going to drag some paint across the pavement area and a little tiny bit across the water. The sky is now finished, but the foreground and midground, this is just an underpainting. And that's enough for that. I'm going to now set it aside and let it dry completely. It's now completely dry, and I'm going to make up 2 mixtures of very weak watery paint, one of indigo and Payne's grey and one of yellow ochre. And I'm just going to use my 3/4 inch flat brush, and I'm going to sort of fairly randomly block in using the flat brush to do most of the work, the buildings that I sketched in at the beginning. I want the paint to be quite weak, not very pigmented, so that this distant skyline of the city doesn't stand out too much. Now I'm using some horizontal strokes and some are vertical to add a little bit of variety, and I'm just moving here and there across the painting, just trying to build up some sort of a balance. I'm not copying the photograph exactly, just trying to get a rough impression of it, and all I need here for the background is different shapes and sizes and shades of geometric blocky shapes that once I've got them all in there, they should all look like a fairly convincing semi-abstract city skyline. I'm varying the colour slightly and the tones, but still keeping it quite pale. I don't mind if the brush skips a bit, and if I get dry brush, that'll give me some nice textures. So as I fill in this urban space, I'm trying to keep a sort of a harmony, but some variety as well, if that makes sense. Now I'm going in, layering up with the transparent watercolour in places, just to darken up. So this is like the buildings that are sort of slightly further forward, and lower down I'm just using a richer mix of paint. I'm varying some of the shapes, maybe making some just slightly angled roofs as well as the very blocky ones. Just working my way across, just trying to establish a balanced kind of skyline. Trying to get enough darks in now so it looks like there are lots of different layers of buildings going back into the distance. I'm going to use the tips of the brush and some sort of fairly dark paint just to add some sort of some vertical lines, just to add more variety and to suggest aerials, telegraph poles, all that sort of thing. Something in nothing really, but it just adds a slightly different dynamic to the background. Trying to keep them sort of fairly uneven and not too many of them. I shall add some later on as I add to the city skyline. Deepen it up a bit later. I'm going to add a bit more yellow ochre to this left hand side. Just I want it to look as if it's catching the sunlight a little bit more. So I'm going to have it a bit sort of yellower on the left and keep it bluer and greyer on the right side. I'm taking my time because this skyline is quite important. I'm getting a nice sort of dark lower horizon line, slowly sort of joining everything up, and eventually it'll be completely joined across the bottom. It should stand out very nicely against the river. Again, getting some darker indigo and Payne's grey mixture across this side so that this the right side is in more shadow. Now just before it dries, I've got a cut up piece of plastic store card and I'm just scraping it through the moist paint horizontally and vertically, just again to add extra texture and geometric shapes and a little bit more variety to the background. Now I'm going to leave it to completely dry and then come back and carry on with some of the foreground features. There's a very strong feature in this sort of railings and lampposts that run diagonally through into the distance and vanish at the vanishing point on the horizon. They're a very strong feature, so I have penciled in the position of them so that I can make sure that I get nice accurate perspective. And I'm using a nice rich mixture of Payne's grey and indigo and my flat brush. And to start with, I'm going to put in these main posts or pillars, whatever they are in the photograph. I'm having them as posts, the ones that support the lamp posts and the ones between, because it's every second pillar has a lamp post. So I'm going to get those in first, and then I shall simplify the photograph much further and put in just simple railings. But for now I'm just going to use the flat brush and I'm following my penciled in lines, and I'm just going to go up as far as the bottom of where I want my lamps themselves to be. Now I'm taking this up a little bit higher because the tallest building in the background got a little bit too tall, so in order to balance the picture up I've had to make the lamppost slightly taller than I'd originally intended, so I've taken that pole up a bit further. Now this is the nearest support, concrete support or whatever, or part of the railings, so I'm just going to take that down off the tape, so that when the tape's removed that fence will kind of disappear out of the frame. You can already see, I think, how this nice strong dark very pigmented paint is standing out very nicely against the softer colours that we've got for the underpainting and the background. I'm taking my time, but I'm not worried about perfection here. I just want to make sure that my posts are vertical, in the right place and in the right perspective. I want them to get closer together as I go further into the distance, and for them to get shorter and also a little bit paler if I can, just to kind of give the impression of aerial perspective. My paint is a nice sort of inky consistency, so it flows, but it's quite thick and dark as well. And I'm just making sure it's just on the tips of the brush and that I'm touching the brush to the paper, so I just get this very fine line. Again, I'm following my pencil lines. And if it's a little bit too dark, just carefully dab with the tissue and that will remove some of the paint. Again, just knocking those poles that are further back into the distance a little bit more. I'm not going to paint the very distant ones just yet. I'll leave that till later. I'll need a different, smaller brush for that. Now, using the same paint, I'm just going to sweep it across the pavement, leaving a gap so that we can see a bit of river beyond the pavement. And then I'm going to take a squirrel mop brush, it's wet, I'm going to run it along underneath the paint there and just soften that out and allow the paint to flood down into the pavement area to add texture, and the same bringing it down across the bottom of those lampposts, allowing a little bit of the paint from the lamppost to bleed into the pavement area. Now this will start to give me some texture. Now, using my bristle brush, I'm going to use the same paint and I'm going to spatter into the damp pavement area again to add texture. It should diffuse quite a lot because the area is already very damp, but I'm just going to start to build up some texture there and then add some more spatter later on. I'm just going to very gently just brush very lightly across the pavement area, adding a bit more texture, smudging it out a little tiny bit and softening with the flat brush. Now I've got some of the darks in the foreground with the lampposts just started, I can begin to balance up the background a little bit more, and I can see that I need to just darken up the abstract sort of building shapes in the background. So I'm just using a bit more of the indigo and Payne's grey mixture and the flat brush, and using the same sort of shapes but a lot darker. I mean, it will dry lighter than that, to be honest, but that still would just begin to balance things out a little bit more. We'll put some more darker tones in as well, and just gradually bring the building together. Now I'm putting in a few of these upright, just vertical lines here and there, which is just adding a bit more texture and just a bit more visual interest to the background. Just breaking up the blocky shapes of the buildings a bit more. If you add anything that's a bit too dark, you can just knock it back very quickly with a tissue, and most of it or all of it will wipe off if you're quick. Just going to add a little bit more spatter to the foreground. Again, just starting to build up or working on building up texture for the foreground. I'm now going to leave it to dry completely and then come back and carry on. Now it's all completely dried, and I've been looking at it, and I think I need some taller buildings on this side to balance it up a bit, but also to distract from the very tall building that's a bit shaped a bit like a bottle, which is just a bit too prominent at the moment. So, I mean, it was a bit of a mistake for me to draw it in so large, but it just that's what happened. So when things like that happen, try not to worry or panic, and just think, is there anything you can do about it? And I've decided that if I add a few more buildings around in front of and behind this building, it'll take a little while with the transparent watercolour to build up the layers, but I should just be able to increase the density of buildings on the left, and in that way distract from that large bottle shaped building, and also I think it'll give me a nicer look to have more buildings and higher buildings on the left than the right. I'll keep coming back to that and working a bit more on it as we go. I'll leave that to dry now. Now I'm going to quickly sweep in some yellow ochre, rich paint across the sea area, or the river. I think I should have done this before my lampposts, so if you're going to follow along, I would suggest that you put the water in sort of horizontal streaks, leaving some dry brush sparkle. I'd suggest that you do that before the lampposts. I think I got a bit carried away wanting to get those lampposts in, and I forgot that I had to put the sea in, but it's worked out all right. Luckily there's not too much colour run or anything like that. It looks okay. Next, I'm going to very lightly pencil in my lamps on top of my lamp posts and make sure I get them to the right size and the right sort of proportions. I want them to get slightly smaller as they go further back and recede into the distance. But I want to make sure that they look right, because they're really going to show up against that plain sky. the lampposts in that sort of perspective work to sort of lead the eye towards the riverbank, where I'm going to put some figures and some trees eventually. Now I'm going to paint in the lamps using the Payne's grey mixture, maybe with a bit of indigo in it, and I'm going to go backwards and forwards between my flat brush and my small Chinese calligraphy brush, which has got a nice point. I'm just trying to get this sort of upside down bell shape for the lamps, keeping it very, very simple. Keep it quite flat and sort of slightly angled across the top. A little bit of something and nothing detail on the top. I'm not going to be too fussy with these. Quick line part way up the centre, which kind of looks like maybe the angled glass or something like that. A cup of coffee always helps, or your beverage of choice. And then on to the rest, just copying those shapes but making them slightly smaller as they recede into the distance. It's a bit awkward because I'm having to work around the camera tripod here. I'm getting there. Right, those are all in now, and I think they look quite effective. And a quick spatter of the dark paint onto the dry painting just brings out that texture even more. I've added a bit more detail to the buildings, and I'm just going to wipe a bit of that across with a damp tissue just to blend those buildings together a little bit more. It's slightly overworked, but it's one of those things. I think it'll look all right when the rest of the details are in. I'm now going to wait for everything to dry, especially the spatter on the pavement. Now it's all nice and dry, and I'm going to begin the process of painting in my railings. I have really simplified from the photograph, and I'm literally just going to put these in as poles or posts between these larger pillars or railings. I think beginners sometimes, in fact a lot of us sometimes get quite get the urge to copy photographs exactly. But of course that isn't always possible unless you are really into photorealism. And for this loose style of painting, I don't think an exact copy of a photograph would really work. So to be painting sort of simply just the kind of rough effect, i.e. here we need a border between the pavement and the river and an edging, something also that will be a nice strong dark detail simply to lead the eye into the painting. So just this repeated simple pattern of railings that will get slightly smaller as they go further back into the distance should be effective enough for a semi-abstract loose painting like this. Just try to keep your strokes vertical. And if you need to pencil in a line from the vanishing point, just to show you how far to go up for the top of your railings, that's probably a good idea. I think it's nice to sort of get them all looking an even size. As they get closer and closer in the distance, I've just literally swept the brush across that piece there. Soften it back a bit. And lastly, I'll use my small flat brush just to fill in the very, very tiny marks that go towards the vanishing point. And now for my final details. I'm going to have some trees across, small trees, right on the edge of the painting, across on the left side, just here. All the paint's nice and dry there, so I'm okay to go in, and I'm using a medium-sized rigger, and I'm going to keep my tree shapes very, very simple. I think everything here is quite geometric, apart from the spatter shape. So, the spatter pattern on the pavement. So having just a little bit of this kind of random shape of the trees, I think would just soften down this very geometric effect. Keeping my trees fairly small. I don't want them to be too big. I'm looking at the size of the lampposts just opposite where the trees are, and trying to keep the proportions about the same. This is my Payne's Grey and Indigo mixture. It's quite heavy on the indigo to give it that nice bluish black tone. It works very well against the yellow ochre of the buildings. Now I'm just going to paint in some very small distant figures using the Frank Clark method of just painting a sort of an upside down carrot shape for the body and a dot for the head. I'm going to join it with another character, so there are two distant figures next to the tree. And then just two more painted in exactly the same way, a little bit further over. These are going to be very slightly larger, so it looks like they're just a little bit closer to us. Just suggesting the idea of figures in the distance, not deliberately trying to paint figures. Now I think I'll just add one more person to this group here, just a smaller person walking next to this couple. So it's not 2 and 2, it's now 3 and 2. I think that will do for my distant figures. Using the same method, but slightly larger this time, two closer figures. Again, using that dark mixture and just suggesting the figure by drawing this sort of upside down, sort of elongated triangle or sort of carrot type shape. And then one next to it, and a couple of dots for heads, and maybe just a few adjustments to try and make this pair of figures look quite convincing as they're a little bit closer. They just need to be slightly more detailed, but not much more. Just the little dots for the heads, not too large, keep them nice and small. and I think they look okay. We'll put a couple of highlights on them in a minute. But first I'm just going to run a little bit of shadow, not much, just a suggestion of shadow underneath them. It just kind of grounds them onto the pavement a bit more. And the same with the distant figures, although I'm going to smudge it out, so it's just a suggestion of a bit of a darker shadow there. Just smudged slightly. And I'm happy with that. Now the last thing I'm going to do is I've got a little bit of white gouache in a lid, it's a jar lid, and I've just made up a strong mixture of it, and I'm just dotting a bit into each one of the lamps. Just to add a highlight. This is where it's so important for the perspective to be right, because you can really see clearly now that the highlight's gone in. I'm going to just dab some highlights here and there across the city skyline at the back. Just dots and dabs and dashes and little marks here and there. As many or as few as you like. Just to give maybe the hint of some windows or a bit of reflection. Some texture, just some maybe lights, street lamps in the distance, that sort of thing. I think it just really finishes it off and links things together really well. A little bit of a highlight on each person, just a dab of white just on the head or the shoulders, just to make them pop a little bit more. And I think that's finished. I'm quite pleased with that. It's a little bit darker than it looks in this photograph because there's a lot of light in the window. This is closer to the look of it. I've waited till it was dry, removed all the tape, and hopefully you can see how the very simple shapes and simply painted parts of this picture have come together to give us a very interesting overall look. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and click on the bell icon if you want to be notified every time I upload a new video, which is 2 or 3 times a week. And thanks again to my lovely Patreon group who support this channel. I'll see you again soon then. Take care, stay safe, and happy painting. Bye.